In January 1692, the air in Salem village hung thick with wood smoke and fear. Inside Reverend Samuel Parris's house, his daughter Betty and niece Abigail Williams were convulsing on the floor, their bodies twisting as if seized by an invisible force. They screamed, threw things, and claimed to see dark shapes hovering in the corners. Within weeks, more girls in the village showed the same terrifying symptoms: violent fits, uncontrollable sobbing, and wild accusations of being tormented by witches. By the time the madness ended 8 months later, 19 people would be hanged, 1 man crushed to death, and hundreds more accused of dealing with the devil. But this isn't a story of supernatural evil. It's a story of how fear, religious extremism, and petty malice can turn a small community into a killing field. To understand Salem, you have to understand the world that created it. Salem Village in 1692 wasn't some quaint New England town. It was a divided, anxious community, trapped between its rigid Puritan faith and the chaos of life on the colonial frontier. The Puritans believed the world was a battlefield between God and Satan. Every natural disaster, every illness, was a sign of the devil's work. Witches, they believed, were humans who had made a pact with the devil, trading their souls for the power to harm others. And their law, based on the Old Testament, made witchcraft a crime, punishable by death. But Salem's anxieties were more than just spiritual. The village was split between wealthy merchants in the east and poorer, more isolated farmers in the west. This divide had already sparked years of conflict over taxes, land, and who should be the village reverend. When Reverend Parris arrived, his fire and brimstone preaching only made things worse, alienating many of his parishioners. Socially, life was suffocating, especially for women, who had few rights and were expected to be silent and pious. For young girls like Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, the boredom and repression were overwhelming. In a community where even dancing was a sin, their sudden fits might have started as a way to get attention. But once the accusations began, there was no turning back. The trouble started when Betty and Abigail began sneaking into the parlor with Tituba, Reverend Parris' enslaved woman from Barbados. Tituba told them stories of Caribbean folklore spirits, omens, and fortune-telling. To the girls, these stories were an escape. They started trying to predict their future husbands using a Venus glass, a practice strictly forbidden by their faith. When Reverend Parris discovered this, he flew into a rage, accusing them of consorting with the devil. Soon after, the fits began. The village doctor couldn't find a physical cause, so he gave the diagnosis that would seal the community's fate. The evil hand is upon them. Word spread like wildfire. Soon, other young girls in the village, like Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, began having the same symptoms. They would fall into trances, screaming that they were being pricked by invisible pins, and point to members of the community as their tormentors. Their accusations were vivid and terrifying. They claimed to see the accused standing over them, handing them contracts to sign in blood. The first 3 accused were Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne III, women who perfectly fit the Puritan stereotype of a witch. Tituba was an enslaved woman, an outsider. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar. Sarah Osborne was a widow who had scandalized the village by marrying her servant. None of them had the social standing to defend themselves. When they were brought before the magistrates, the girls screamed and fell into fits at the sight of them. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne insisted they were innocent. But Tituba, after being beaten by Parris, broke down. She spun a wild tale of being visited by the devil, who appeared as a black dog and a tall man in a black coat. She said he ordered her to sign his book, where she saw the names of the other 2 women and more. Tituba's confession was a turning point. It confirmed the Puritans' worst fears. Satan had infiltrated their community. The magistrates began issuing warrants for more arrests, and by March, dozens of people had been accused. The trials began in April 1692. The rules of evidence were nothing like we know today. The most damning proof was spectral evidence testimony from the girls that they had seen an accused person's invisible spirit, or spectral shape, tormenting them. To the Puritan judges, this was valid because they believed only someone who made a pact with the devil could send their spirit to harm others. Other evidence was just as flimsy. In a touch test, if an accused witch touched a girl having a fit and the fit stopped, It was seen as proof of guilt. Puppets, or dolls, found in a home were considered tools of witchcraft, even if they were just children's toys. The trials weren't about finding the truth. They were designed to confirm guilt. The judges weren't impartial. They were true believers who saw themselves as soldiers in a war against Satan. The accused had no lawyers. They couldn't call witnesses in their defense, and they were presumed guilty from the start. The first person to be hanged was Bridget Bishop, a tavern owner known for her flamboyant red dress and her outspoken nature. On June 10th, she was led to Gallows Hill and executed. The accusations then spiraled out of control. Soon, it wasn't just social outcasts being targeted. Respected church members, wealthy landowners, and even a former minister were accused. Rebecca Norsay, a 71-year-old grandmother known for her piety, was declared innocent by the jury, but the judges, pressured by the screaming girls in the courtroom, ordered the jury to reconsider. They came back with a guilty verdict, and she was hanged. People realized that no one was safe. If someone held a grudge against you, if they wanted your land, or if they simply disliked you, all it took was a whisper to the afflicted girls. The case of John Proctor is one of the most tragic. Proctor, a successful farmer, was one of the few who spoke out against the trials from the beginning, calling the accusers liars. In retaliation, his own servant, Mary Warren, accused him. When his wife defended him, she was accused of trapped in prison. Proctor wrote a letter to the governor, begging for the trials to be moved to Boston, where he believed they might get a fair hearing. His plea was ignored. On August 19th, he was hanged alongside 4 others, including George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village. Burroughs stunned the crowd on Gallows Hill by perfectly reciting the Lord's Prayer, something a witch was thought incapable of doing. The crowd began to murmur, to question what was happening. But it wasn't enough to stop the executions. One of the most brutal stories is that of Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer. Corey knew that if he was tried and convicted, his land and property would be confiscated, leaving his family with nothing. So he chose a different path. He refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. According to the law at the time, the punishment for this was pene forte, a dure, strong and hard punishment. He was laid on the ground, a wooden board placed on his chest, and heavy stones were piled on top, one by one, to force him to plead. For 2 days, he endured the agony. His only words were a defiant demand for more weight. He was crushed to death, but because he was never convicted, his property passed to his sons. His death stands as a horrifying symbol of protest against the madness. By the fall of 1692, the tide began to turn. The accusations had become too outrageous. The accusers, emboldened by their power, even pointed a finger at the wife of Governor William Phipps. Finally, the governor had seen enough. He had been away fighting on the frontier for much of the year, but upon his return, he was horrified by what he found. In October, he ordered a halt to the proceedings and disbanded the court. He established a new court that forbade the use of spectral evidence. Without the girls' visions as proof, the cases fell apart. The remaining prisoners were slowly released over the next few months. The Salem witch trials were over, but the legacy of fear, guilt, and shame would haunt the community for generations. Years later, some of the accusers and judges offered public apologies, and Putnam Jr., one of the most active accusers, stood before the Salem Village Church in 1706 and confessed that she had acted out of a great delusion of Satan. Samuel Sewell, one of the main judges, publicly acknowledged his error and asked for forgiveness. But apologies couldn't bring back the dead. They couldn't erase the betrayal that had ripped families and friendships apart. So what really happened in Salem? Historians have debated the causes for centuries. Some point to a fungus called ergot, which can grow on rye bread and cause symptoms like convulsions and hallucinations. Others suggest a form of insanity. But most scholars now believe the crisis was primarily psychological and social. It was a perfect storm of community conflict, religious fanaticism, and mass hysteria, ignited by a small group of traumatized and repressed young women. In a world that offered them no power, accusing others gave them a voice and an influence they could never have dreamed of. The Salem witch trials serve as a chilling reminder of how Isaiah society can descend into madness. It's a story about the danger of unchecked authority, the power of fear, and the deadly consequences of believing without questioning. It shows us that the most terrifying monsters aren't spirits or demons, but the darkness that can live within ordinary people when they abandon reason for fanaticism. The events of 1692 are not just a strange footnote in history. They are a timeless warning. A warning about what happens when we demonize those who are different, when we sacrifice justice for security, and when we allow fear to become our guide. Thanks for watching. If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's most fascinating and unsettling moments. Let us know in the comments what historical event you'd like to see us cover next. See you in the next video.